Good morning, welcome back. Today is July 10th, and before we get back to talking about Luke 21, let's talk a little bit about the things that happened on this date in history. Well, first of all, it was in 1629 on this date that the first non-separatist congregational church was founded in the colonies and later to become the United States. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, a non-separatist church would be a church not tied into the Pilgrims. So if you remember your U.S. history, the Pilgrims were the ones that came from England to Holland and then back over to the colonies that wanted to separate from the Church of England and create a new church. Whereas the Puritans, who were very similar in doctrine, the biggest difference being that they wanted to purify the church. Okay, so that's why the non-separatist element. Now, a congregational church is a church that many of us are used to. A congregational church is a church simply that is run by the members. Prior to the idea of congregationalism, a church would have been run by a bishop or the priest, or there would be a hierarchy. And there are a lot of churches and a lot of denominations in the United States that still run this way. But essentially, if you're in a Baptist church and a lot of Methodist churches, I believe, you have what is called a congregational church polity is the word that's often used. And there are churches that are called congregational churches. And basically that just means it's run by the members. Okay. Now this church is considered to be the first truly congregational church founded in the United States, in Salem. It is still in operation today. Now it is not the oldest church in the United States, but it's pretty close. Okay, so it's on Essex Street in Salem, Massachusetts. Now, some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, I've heard of Salem in regards to the 17th century. Is this the church? Yes and no. Now, if you talk to somebody in Salem at this church, they will point out to you that the Salem witch trials, which I've been alluding to, actually took place in a town which is next door, New Salem, or which is now called Danvers, Massachusetts. But there were people in this church that were involved in the Salem witch trials. They're back at the end of the 17th century. But that was founded on this date in 1629. In 1778, Louis XVI declares war on England. Louis XVI of France declares war on England. Now, for those of you who have seen the musical Hamilton, where King George comes out and sings, "You cheat with the French, and now I'm fighting wars with France and with Spain," this is what he's talking about. As a result of the work of people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, France was convinced to go to war against England at the same time that the colonies were rebelling against them as well. Now, Louis XVI is an interesting guy. His wife, many of you may remember as being Marie Antoinette, wasn't really a great king. Generally speaking, of all the great kings of France, he's not listed high on the list. But I did read a book once about the last few years of his life, especially when he was arrested by the French Revolution and ultimately executed, as was Marie Antoinette. And it's really a fairly sad story. And one of the other interesting things about Louis XVI is many talk about him as he became a much better king once he was deposed, that his actions and his attitude and his mannerisms were much more kingly once he was deposed. Kind of an interesting idea. But Louis XVI declares war on England on this date in 1778. In 1850, Millard Fillmore became the President of the United States, the 13th President of the United States, upon the death of Zachary Taylor, who had been elected. Now, Millard Fillmore is interesting because for a number of reasons. Number one, a lot of surveys put Millard Fillmore way at the bottom of the effective president's list, which may or may not be fair. I don't know. I wasn't around back then. But interestingly, Millard Fillmore was the last president of the United States not affiliated with either the Republican or the Democratic Party. He only filled out his term, and then in 1854, the Whig Party pretty much fell apart. And by 1856, he filled out the term, and then by 1856, the Republicans were a party. And of course, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln becomes the president. But there is a group of people, or have been a group of people, that are dedicated to the restoration of the reputation of Millard Fillmore, and they're referred to as the Millard Fillmore Society. Remember the last time I was here, I was talking about the Richard III Society. Well, there's one from Millard Fillmore as well. The Millard Fillmore Society, dedicated toward resurrecting the reputation of our 13th president. In 1934, at the Baseball All-Star game, Hall of Famer Carl Hubbell struck out 5 Hall of Famers in a row. They were Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Foxx, Al Simmons, and Joe Cronin. Still a major league record, an all-star record for strikeouts in an all-star game. In 1972, the Democratic Convention opened in Miami. For those of you who were around at the time, this was best known for being the one where George McGovern was nominated, and also because the speechifying went on for so long that it wasn't announced that McGovern got the nomination, and he didn't get up to do his speech until like 3 o'clock in the morning. And ever since that time, these conventions have been very strictly time controlled, so that the candidate, whoever the presidential candidate is, gets to make his speech or her speech in prime time. But that opened on this date in 1972. And in 1973, John Paul Getty III was kidnapped. John Paul Getty III was the grandson of John Getty, J.P. Getty. And you may remember this story from the recent movie, All the Money in the World. And the story is, this kid is a kind of a hippie. His parents were kind of hippies. His mom and dad had separated, divorced actually, and he was living with his mom. He gets kidnapped in Italy, and the grandfather, John Paul Getty, refuses to pay a dime. Refuses to pay a dime for the rescue, for the ransom of his grandson. Now, John Paul Getty actually, had a difficult life after that. He had some drug issues and alcohol issues, ended up having a stroke, died at the age of 54, back, maybe in the 1990s, I think it was. But it was on this date that John Paul Getty III was kidnapped. He was actually kidnapped for like 5 months. So if you're interested, see the movie. I have not seen the movie, so I can't really say whether it's any good or not, but I do know that that's the subject that this movie is about, all the money in the world. And finally, happy birthday today to John Calvin, born on this date in 1509. John Calvin, who went on to become a second-generation reformer, a great well-known leader, and certainly the author of this classic work, Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. I did remember listening to a guy once, a teacher, an internet guy I was following on YouTube at the time, who mentioned that every day he liked to read a little bit of the Institutes from Mr. Calvin. So I'm sure all the Calvinists out there are having a party today, but it was on this date, 1509, that John Calvin was born. Okay, well, a lot of good stuff today, but we have even better stuff as we get to talking about Luke 21. So let's get back to talking about that right now. Good morning, welcome back. We're here today to talk about Luke chapter 21. And believe it or not, we're actually getting toward the end of Luke. I know it just, I get into these books sometimes and I think, good grief, am I ever going to get to the end of the book? And we are. In fact, the end of chapter 21 kind of sets up the Passion Week, what we call the Passion Week, the arrest and the trial and all of that. And actually we kind of shift into, starting with chapter 22, we shift into more of a narrative text as opposed to a gospel or more narrative / teaching kind of text. And we'll see the difference when we get into it next week. But we are getting toward the end of Luke, and then we're going to roll right into Acts, because this is about Luke and Acts. So today we're in Luke chapter 21, and I ended last time talking about this particular passage. I started in 20 verse 45. It says, while all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the place of honor at banquets. Okay? They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely. Okay, so the key phrase here is where it says they devour widows' houses. And then we go into the start of chapter 21, the story of the widow's mite, okay, the widow's offering. As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins, that is, the widow's mite. Truly I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Okay, so, and again, I mentioned this last week, and the interesting thing about this is I've gone back and forth on this particular passage. Okay, so traditionally, and at least in my memory, whenever the story of the widow and her offering is made here in chapter 21, it's an example. It's been an example of great sacrifice in terms of encouraging people to give. Okay, then I went to the point where I said, okay, no, wait a minute, that's not. It's a condemnation of the teachers of the laws, because here in verse 47, chapter 20, verse 47, it says, beware the teachers of the law, they devour widows' houses, and then the text is linked by the phrase in verse 21, as Jesus looked up. So in other words, Jesus is talking, he says, beware of this, and then he looks up, and he sees this going on, this example of what he was just talking about, okay? So no, this is not saying that this is what you should do. This is actually an example of a bad characteristic, okay? So that's kind of where it is. Then lately, in terms of looking at this particular passage, I begin thinking that although it may still be true that the woman has been pressured to give, and we're thinking beyond the text here, although that may still be true, we can't really fault the woman. We can't really say, oh, she's making a mistake, she's doing something wrong, because what this woman is doing, all indications are she chose freely to do this. So let's give agency to the woman. If that's what she wants to do, great. And she's doing it on her own accord. And this is exactly what Jesus told the rich young ruler to do, the rich young man earlier in the book to do. He said, give all you have. And that's exactly what this woman is doing, okay? And so she's doing exactly what Jesus told the rich young man to do. Now, is this woman somebody like Anna, who lives in the temple? If you remember Anna from earlier, Luke 1 and 2, the prophetess who she and Simeon, met. She'd been there 84 years. So to a certain extent, I'm thinking, this is an example of somebody who gave sacrificially. Okay, she just trusts the support system that she has. She trusts the temple. She trusts the people around her. She trusts God, that God is going to meet her needs, and so she gives her 2 months. She gave everything she had to live on. I mean, that's the way the Greek writes is like she gave her life. She gave everything. Okay, so when this woman walked away from that, she did not know where her next meal was going to come from. She did not know how she was going to pay for her whatever it is she needed to pay for. Okay, not unlike the widow at Zarephath. Okay, where she was going to just put the oil and the flour and make a meal and then not know, and then God in the form of Elijah stepped up and said, "Trust me, I'll take care of you here." So we don't know what happens afterwards, and I think there's a point to be made that this is an example. Maybe she was led to believe that, maybe she was, but let's not just say, oh, well, this woman was deceived, because maybe she just gave her all to do that. Okay, so but with that, we move into the discussion about the end times. Okay, and that is verses 5 through the rest of the chapter are often considered to be the Olivet Discourse. Now, in the book of Matthew, which is structured a little bit differently than, each gospel is structured uniquely. The book of Matthew, I believe, has like 5 major teaching sections. And the one that we're most familiar with is, of course, the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, there's 5 times in the book where Jesus sits down and just starts teaching, and there's a long section. Okay, So the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, we're all very, very, very familiar with. The Olivet Discourse at the end of the book, chapters 25 and 26, or 24 and 25, is a sermon, is a teaching that is done on the Mount of Olives, near to Jerusalem, near the end of Jesus' life. Okay, now some have looked at this particular passage and said, okay, this is Luke's recording of the Olivet Discourse, and that may very well be true. Okay, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Or another alternative is that it could be that this is Luke's accumulation of Jesus teaching about the end times, or from a different point, and needed to put it in somewhere. Okay, I lean toward the idea that this is Luke thinking, okay, here's what Jesus said during the Olivet Discourse that my readers need to know, that I think my readers, Theophilus et al., need to know. Okay, so it isn't that Matthew added stuff or Luke cut stuff in an indiscriminate fashion. Luke was writing for a particular purpose to a particular audience, and he said, this is what the folks that I'm talking to need to know. So let's talk about this question here, okay? In verse 5, so as this is going on, and that's kind of the implication, as all this is going on, Jesus is talking about the teachers of the law, and then he sees the woman. It appears that some of the disciples are just kind of going, wow, this is like a really great, maybe it was the first time they'd ever seen the temple up close. They're like, wow, will you look at the construction on that kind of thing? It's sort of and I kind of get the idea that it's one of those scenarios where you're trying to explain something and the person is just clearly distracted with something completely different than what you're trying to say. So some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. Okay. Now, what I find interesting about this passage, and it's not something that many people bring up, but looking at Luke's emphasis, okay, Luke's emphasis on the outsiders, okay, Luke's emphasis on the poor and the sick and the foreign kind of thing, and it's interesting that Luke says, he talks about the beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God. Okay. Now, on the one hand, we could look at this and we could say, okay, this is just like, and we've all seen these kind of building campaigns where you give a certain amount of money and you get a brick with your name on it. Okay. And you can go there, and anytime you go there, you can go, look, there's our brick kind of thing. All right. Maybe that's kind of what he's talking about. But I wonder what the link is between this and the passage in Mark chapter 7. In Mark chapter 7, let me just go back there real quick. Let's see, Mark 7. Mark 7, verse 11. Jesus is talking, and he continued, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say, okay, now he's talking to Pharisees and teachers of the law here, but you say, if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is, devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that. So I'm kind of wondering if Luke is not subtly calling attention to, here that this temple, this grand edifice, has been in part built on this false, maybe not false, but this crumbling edifice of rejecting God's command in order to follow another one. Okay, this lesson. Oh, I'm going to dedicate this to God. Okay, and this was a way of people not taking care of their parents, as he said in Mark chapter 7. I don't know, just speculation on my part. Okay, but whatever, they're looking at this and they're going, wow, this is a great thing. And it really is. Now, when we were in Israel back in 2017, one of the things that we did was we went to the temple area. Now, of course, the temple is not there. You have the Temple Mount, which is where Islamic Dome of the Rock is now. But one of the things that we did was we went to a church that is located like on the wall, and you can go to the basement of this church and you could see the stones that made up the base, like the underground base of the rock, of what at the time had been the temple wall. And the interesting thing there was to look at the care, and this was like, obviously this is thousands of years previously. You could still look at these rocks, you could look at these boulders, these very large boulders, and see with what care they had been placed. Even these ones that are out of sight, underground, they still did these with great care. Okay, so clearly the ones that would have been visible, if the ones underground, and the point that you're getting at is that if the ones underground had been done with that much care, imagine what the ones that were visible had looked like. Okay, so that's clearly kind of one of the points. So there was certainly something to be marveled at, and they are. Okay, well, Jesus points out and starts going on, and he's going to go for the next several verses, and he's going to talk about three different things, and he's going to intertwine between all three of them. He's going to talk about the fall of the temple, he's going to talk about the fall of Jerusalem, and he's going to talk about his return. Okay, the fall of the temple, fall of Jerusalem, and his return. Okay, now what's interesting here is we kind of look at this and think about how the original listeners, okay, so reacted to this, or what this meant to the original listeners. Okay, and by original listeners, I mean the people that are standing in the presence of Jesus. As Jesus says this, so the disciples are there going, oh, look at these, look at these nice walls. These are great. These are really nice walls. And Jesus says to these disciples and whoever else is there, let me tell you about these walls. Okay, those guys right there. Okay, that's the original listeners. Now, the original readers are the people that Luke is writing this book to. Okay, Theophilus and whoever is around Theophilus. Okay, and so this is one of the things that kind of dates the book, or is taken into account as you date the book. So we'll touch on that here in a little bit. Okay, so let me hold that thought. We'll come back to it in a minute. Okay, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. Okay, now if we go back to this is actually the third time that he has predicted this. Now in Luke chapter 19, just a chapter back, let me see here. Yeah, Luke chapter 19, Jesus comes to Jerusalem. Oh, verse 41. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Now, in Luke 19 and earlier in Luke 13, he's talking about the Jerusalem at large, okay? Whereas here he's specifically talking about the temple. But of course, if not one stone is left on another in all of Jerusalem, that would include the temple, because the temple is clearly within the boundaries of Jerusalem. So this is not new to the listeners, okay? But this is not a new thing to the listeners. And of course, the hearers, the readers, the original readers, if Luke was written after the destruction of Jerusalem, would have looked at this and thought, oh, okay, that's when, Jesus, or even as the end was coming for Jerusalem, this would have been something that the original readers would have looked at it and said, oh, Jesus predicted this was going to happen. Okay, depending on whether you put the writing of Luke before or after the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so that's 70 AD, so that we know that. We're pretty as sure as we are about any date that Jerusalem fell, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Okay, but at this point here, now this is 65 years. Now, Herod had just done, or actually it's 40 years. Herod had just done a great big remodel of the temple, and it was a great big grand edifice. Okay, and Herod was a builder, and there's a lot of big things that Herod had done, and so it would be kind of hard at the time for the listeners, the original listeners, to be hearing this, because Jesus, this big, beautiful, functional, wonderful building, this grand edifice, this temple that is so central to the Jewish religion, which to the original listeners here would have been central to their religion, that Jesus was a prophet of the Jewish religion, and Jesus was always always honored let's just say honored the Jewish religion while he was on earth. Okay, and so for Jesus to just suddenly say, wow, this is all going to be destroyed. Okay, now to a certain extent you could get all philosophical and go, well, yeah, ultimately everything is going to be destroyed at some point, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 years from now. But I think it would be, they took it a little skeptically. Okay, because again, they saw this great thing. They saw this wonderful work. I mean, you ever had a situation, say like you've got a road. I live near I-80, and I-80 or I-55, any of the highways around the Chicago area where I live, are under construction like 6 months out of the year. And we've all had the experience where we've had to deal with a stretch of highway that is under construction for a very long time. Okay, and you're constantly going to the left to right, or slowdowns or backups or all of that kind of stuff. You see the people working on it. But then there's one glorious day where all of a sudden it's all gone. Okay, all of the workers are gone, the roads are gone, the construction trucks are gone, the barricades are gone, everything is gone, and all of a sudden you have this magnificent 4-lane where there used to be 3, or 6-lane where there used to be 4, or exit lanes where you didn't used to have it, and you think this is great. And then right at that moment, to have somebody walk up and go, this is all going to be full of potholes in about 6 months, may be completely true, but nobody wants to hear that, right? You just want to think, no, this time is going to last, okay? So I think the disciples have a little bit of skepticism here as far as what Jesus is saying. And I say that because of how they respond. Okay, they say to him, teacher. Okay, not master, not Lord, teacher. Okay, and if you recall, as we talked through Luke, the way people talk to Jesus kind of indicates something. Okay, so when they say teacher, that suggests a bit of skepticism. Okay, that's kind of like the lowest common denominator in terms of the minimal amount of respect that they have to give. Okay, and so when they say teacher, wait a minute, seriously. Okay, teacher, they asked, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to take place? Okay, once again, I mean, how many times throughout Luke are there people demanding a sign? Okay, Jesus replies, watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name claiming, I am he, the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Now, this to the original listeners would have sounded weird, okay? Because even though Jesus had expressed to them what was going to happen, that he is going to be leaving, that he is going to be arrested and killed and all of that, even though that had been explained to them, it wasn't registering. And it wouldn't have registered for any of us either, okay? We like to look at this and think, oh, well, we would have gotten it. No, we wouldn't have. We would have been just as clueless as the disciples, okay? It's unheard of for somebody to say, to walk into something like that and go, this is what's going to happen. And because the disciples are looking, they see the crowd, they see the adulation, they see the support that Jesus is getting, they see how many people just want to be a part of his ministry. And it would have been hard for them to believe that anything negative could happen. And then for Jesus to say, listen, there's going to be people that come claiming to be me and don't. So this wouldn't have gone over. This would have been confusing. Let's put it that way. Okay. Now, the original readers, Theophilus et al., would have looked at this and said, oh, yeah. Because, of course, this is years after Jesus had died and the resurrection and the ascension. and they said, oh, yeah, there's a lot of people that have been there. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why Luke is writing the book itself, is to avoid the problem that Jesus is predicting right here. Okay, remember in Luke chapter 1 where he talks about Theophysis, so that you would know the certainty of the things about the life of Jesus. And here Jesus is saying that's going to happen, and Luke is saying, okay, I'm going to do my part to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay. So, but regardless, do not follow them. When you hear wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. Those things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Now, I think here he switched to talking about his return. Okay, so again, remember, we're going back and forth between destruction of the temple, destruction of Jerusalem, second coming. Okay, those three things. And here, when he talks about the end, I think he's talking about the greater end, not the end of Jerusalem, not the end of the temple, but his return, the end of this system, or another way to look at the end of this generation. Hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that in a minute. Then he said to them, these things might happen first, but the end will not come right away. Then he said to them, verse 10, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famine, pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. So a lot of stuff is going to happen. And I think what Jesus is just pointing out here is there's going to be a great deal of time that's going to elapse. And I say that based on the fact that we are reading this 2,000 years later, and this has not happened yet. Okay, and yet those of us who are those who are predisposed to believe that Jesus is going to return, millenarians, think that at some point it will. Okay, so this is just kind of an indication that Jesus knew then that his return was not going to be soon. Now, this doesn't stop the disciples and the apostles in Acts chapter 1 of saying, so Lord, are you going to restore the kingdom now? Okay, one day after he's been, or 40 days after he's been executed. Okay, but in verse 12 he gives a warning. He says, but before all of this, and I think another way to look at this is not necessarily before all this, that is the end, or all these things happening at the end, something's going to happen to you. And again, there's a very immediate fulfillment to what Jesus has to say, and there's a longer term fulfillment to the hearers, the original readers, to Theophilus et al., that are hearing this. He says, but before all this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. Okay, so again, there's going to be political persecution. There's going to be religious persecution. Okay, again, brought before kings and governors, and then brought to the synagogues, turned over to the synagogues. Okay, so again, at some point, the synagogues, the local organizing structure of the Jewish religion is going to reject you. So at some point, so I think here Jesus is making clear that, listen, I'm breaking at some point with Judaism as it is being practiced. Okay, so as it is being practiced at the time, it's like this, I'm breaking with this, and they're going to realize this eventually. Now, one of the things historically, when you look at Christianity and its development in the first century, that for a long period of time, Christianity, by those outside of both Judaism and Christianity was just seen as an offshoot of Judaism. It's just kind of like, it's just a strange little, it's a, just a, I don't know little faction of Judaism. Okay, now those within Christianity and those within Judaism know that there's more to it than that, but those outside just saw it as the same thing, two sides of the same coin. Okay, but he says all these things are going to happen to you, and so you will bear testimony to me. But and I think this is an interesting passage. He says, but make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourself. Okay, so he's not telling you don't worry. He's saying decide now that you're not going to worry about this, because when it happens, you will get the word. And I just trust that this is true. Okay, and when you read stories of people under great persecution, and you read transcripts of the things they said, people being killed, and you think to yourself, wow, how can they say that? How can they be so calm? I'm thinking I think to myself, I would be just a basket case, and yet I think those are examples of this promise being made true. I hope personally that this is not a promise I personally will ever have to claim, but here it is. Okay. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers or sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Okay, so we've talked about earlier how belief in Jesus and in the way, as Christianity was called, does upset family relationships. It supersedes them. Okay, and then some of you will be put to death. Okay, now again, immediate fulfillment in that many of those that are listening to him, certainly many of the 12, will ultimately be put to death. Okay. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm and you will win life. Okay. Now, I think here he's talking about in an eternal sense, not a hair of your head will perish, because certainly if you die, then you've perished, and that would include your hair as well. But I think he's talking about this in an eternal sense. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. That stand firm, and it isn't that you have to stand firm in order to go to heaven, that's going to be your test. It's just that those who are already believers will be the ones who stand firm. Okay, stand firm, and you will win. And you will win life. Okay, there's an interesting. This is a tricky phrase. This verse: stand firm, and you will win life. Okay, so maybe that's just like right now. Make the decision now, and that's how you get life. It isn't you have to go through all of this in order to win life. Because if that's the case, those of us who have not faced this kind of persecution, and if you live in the United States, you haven't faced this kind of persecution. In Matthew chapter 10, it says there's another passage that's kind of similarly tricky. It says those who survive to the end will be saved. And again, I think there he's just, the only ones who are going to survive to the end are those that are already saved, or those, saved is the word we use, those who are believers, Christ followers to the end there. Verse 20, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Okay. There's a great line in Hamlet that we use around Shea a lot. Needs not a ghost come from beyond the grave to tell us this, my lord. That's because Hamlet has just seen his father's ghost, and he has the tete-a-tete with him, and then he comes back, and Horatio says, what did you see? And there's not he just makes an insult to people that live in Denmark, and Horatio's response is, needs not a ghost come from beyond the grave to tell us this, my lord. In a similar way, this is a pretty obvious statement. Okay, when you see your city surrounded by an army, the end is near. Okay, now those who are reading this, those who are listening to this, don't see the threat. Okay, because they're part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is very strong. It's not going to officially fall for another 300 or 400 years. But within the city itself, there's going to be some destruction happening, largely due to revolts and rebellions and things like that over the course of the next several hundred years. But he said, and again, keep in mind, these are post-captivity Jews that are listening to this. Okay, so this has already happened in Jerusalem once. They've already seen the Assyrians and the Syrians and the Babylonians and the Persians, all these guys surrounding the city and taking people captive. So he's calling up an image that is in the mind of the Jewish residents, but he's saying that this is going to happen again. And when you see this, you'll know. Now, we know in 70 AD that Titus is going to come through and just kind of wipe everything out, largely due to rebellions on the part of of the Jews on the Jewish residents there of the Levant. Okay. But then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out. Let those in the country not enter the city. So again, it's just kind of common sense. If you see an army surrounding your city, if you're outside of that, so if you're in Judea, which means you're outside of the circle of army, go to the mountains. Okay. If you're outside of the city, don't enter the city. Okay. If you're in the city, try and get out somehow. Okay. And all indications are, from what I've read of these kind of things, is that these that wasn't as difficult as you might think. That there was a lot. These sieges were relatively porous. People could get in and out to a certain extent. I mean, you couldn't bring supplies in, but a person could sneak in, sneak out. It was certainly possible. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. Okay. So again, I think here Jesus is talking about the fall of Jerusalem, and it could be in 70 AD, and it could be, and I think he's referring both to a greater fall, perhaps sometime later, in Ezekiel 14. Ezekiel 14. Let me just read just one passage from there, just to kind of give you an idea of what he's talking about. Ezekiel 14, verse 21 says, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, how much worse will it be when I send against Jerusalem my 4 dreadful judgments, sword and famine and wild beast and plague, to kill its men and their animals." Okay, then it goes on and says, "Yet there will be some survivors." In Hosea 9:7, there's another, let's see, where is Hosea? That's Hosea 9:7. And again, Hosea is written after the time of the these are prophets that are writing during the captivity era. Okay, so they've already seen this. So this isn't talking about what has happened. This is talking about what's going to yet to happen. The days of punishment are coming. The days of reckoning are at hand. I'm in Hosea chapter 9, verse 7. Let Israel know this, because your sins are so many and your hostility so great. The prophet is considered a fool, the inspired person a maniac. Okay, so again, Jesus is just referring all these things, and there's other passages in the Old Testament that talk about this, that this is going to come. And again, so this is like the last thing, because Jesus is going towards Jerusalem. He's going toward his last week. He knows he's going to be killed. And he's kind of given a big picture of what's going to happen in the future. Okay, so what's going to happen next? What are the next set of events? And so I think that's what he's trying to reassure people. And that's the thing about eschatology. That is the doctrine of last things. It is supposed to give us hope. It is supposed to give us confidence that God has a plan. And yet what we tend to do is we tend to get lost in the details and try to identify what this is and what that is, and whether it's the mark of the beast or whatever, whether it's, I won't go into that, because once you get into that, you never get out. For this is written, how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people, that is, the Jews who are in the town at the time. And of course, those who are expecting and those who have small children certainly will have a more difficult time than those who are able to just up and run. Okay, they will fall by the sword, talking about the people, and will be taken as prisoners to all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Okay, so again, there's other destruction, other invasions that are going to take place for Jerusalem, to Jerusalem. And some look at this and think, okay, well, the Islamic takeover in the 6th century, 7th century, whenever that was, that's part of it. And this was kind of the argument that went into the Crusades, that, we need to go in and rescue it back. Okay. But again, still in looking about answering the questions, he says, there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. In Mark chapter 13, Mark talks a little bit about this, or Mark records it something else that Jesus said earlier. I can get to the page. Verse 20, Mark chapter 13, verse 24. But in those days following that distress, the sun will be darkened and the moon will give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now, what exactly does it look like? I don't know. I mean, are we talking about earthquakes? Well, he did say earlier there would be earthquakes. But the end thing, verse 27, at that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. And I think one of the points to make here is that when Jesus returns, it's not going to be mistaken. Okay? It's going to be very clear what's going on. Okay? I know when you look at a newspaper type, they talk about second coming type. Okay? You like the size, the font size, that like Jesus returns, that it's like as large a font as you can get. Okay. He told them this parable: look at the fig tree and all the trees, and all the trees. That's an interesting point here, because the other Olivet Discourse discussions only talk about a fig tree, whereas Luke is getting out of this Israel image and saying, look at all the trees. Okay, there's just a basic lesson here that if you're a gardener, and I happen to be married to one, that there's a certain look of a plant, and you know that when the plant gets to this particular look, there's going to be whatever fruit or vegetable that plant is supposed to grow. Okay, and Jesus is just using the fig tree and all trees to say, look at these. You know, when you see the signs of the fig tree, you know there's going to be figs there. When you see the sign, when a tomato plant gets to such and such a height, and you see the flowers, you know there's going to be tomatoes there eventually. Okay, and he's saying, I'm just telling you these things so that you know there will be some indication of what. Now, how bad is it going to get? I don't know, because we haven't gotten there yet. Even so, when you see these things happening, verse 31, you know that the kingdom of God is near. And that is the return. Okay? That is Christ's return, the end, as it were spoken. Verse 32, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Okay? So, when he talks about this generation, is he talking about the age group of the people that are standing in front of him? Okay, well, if you say yes, you have a problem in explaining how all of these earth-shaking kind of things haven't occurred yet. Okay, so I think the idea of generation, and Jesus uses the word for generation in many different ways, and I think it's our habit in 21st century, 20th and 21st century, the 20th and 21st century West, to think that every time you use the word generation, you have to be referring to this 20 or 30 year period. Okay. Earlier in Luke chapter 9, Jesus refers to this wicked and adulterous generation. How long will you seek a sign? And I think a better way to look at this idea of a generation is to say, this generation, this group of people who insist on rebelling against the rule of God. Okay, and this wicked and this generation, in that sense, starts at the Garden of Eden, and it continues till July 10th, 2022. Okay, so rather than just saying, okay, it's just this 122. Now, you could look at some of these things are going to happen literally to, some of the persecutions are going to happen literally, but at this point, Jesus isn't talking about persecution. He's talking about the grand end of things. Okay, and I think he's just saying this perverse generation is going to last, and there will be people here that will see this thing happen. But he says in verse 34, be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and anxieties of life, and the day will close on you suddenly like a trap. For it will come on all those who live on the face of the whole earth. Be always on watch, and pray that you may be able to escape all that is to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. Okay? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back up to 32 for a second. This generation. And in verse 33 it says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Okay? So Jesus is speaking here, and when he says, My words will never pass away. That is an interesting thing. So a Jewish scholar, a teacher of the law listening there would have thought of Isaiah 40, where Isaiah there, comfort my people, in Isaiah 40, where he says, heaven and earth, but the word of our God endures forever. So when Jesus says, heaven and earth may pass away, but what I'm saying is going to endure forever, he's putting his words into the same category as the word of God. And I think that's kind of an interesting link up there. He says, listen, this is going to happen, man. This is, my warning here should not be avoided. Take care, be careful, don't let it sneak up on you. Okay? And again, eschatology is an interesting topic. It's a fun read. But it's overall the thing about eschatology, and that is the doctrine of last things. The thing about eschatology is it should be hopeful. It should bring confidence. It should bring assurance to believers that there is a plan, that God has a plan. And to me, I remember I taught Revelation a few years ago. I remember I said that the theme of Revelation is that God wins. Okay, that's the theme. Okay, we can and we kind of get involved trying to think, okay, how do we fit this into this, and see, this person did this, and maybe he's that, and we kind of, who are the two witnesses, and how are they going to, and all the 144,000, are they, we kind of get lost in the details on that. Okay, but all of that, all of Revelation, is just a great way of instilling confidence in the believers to go, listen, there's a plan. It's going to take a while. And Jesus has made it clear here. It's going to take a while. But there's a plan. It's going to take a while. Again, now back to 34. Be careful or your hearts will be weighed down. I read this already. Be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen. What's interesting about this passage is Jesus says, pray that you'll be able to escape this. Okay, that suggests that there's a physical risk here, that there will be believers, Christ followers, who are going to be physically affected by this. Okay, that is something for those of us who are pre-tribbers. And again, I'm speaking to, this is a very inside baseball, to kind of take into consideration and think, okay, wait a minute here. How does this fit into our pre-trib theology? I don't have an answer for that, so it's going to be something I'm going to be working on as time goes on. And that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. So be sure of your salvation. Be sure of where you're going. And this is a great last thing that Jesus is saying. These are like the last words that he's given to this group. Now, I know he's got the upper room discourse in John and all, but here, this near the end, he's reminding people, listen, it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's really what it comes down to. So be sure of whose side you're on. Okay. Verse 37 is the final passage, a couple of verses here in this chapter, and this is where we really start setting up for the end. Okay. Each day Jesus was teaching at the temple, and each evening he went out to spend the night on a hill called the Mount of Olives, and all the people came early in the morning to hear him at the temple. Okay, so Jesus is becoming a visible problem for the Jewish leaders. Okay, every day he comes into town, and there's a crowd at the temple listening to him talk. And most of his talk is very critical of the Jewish establishment, critical of the Pharisees, critical of the teachers of the law, critical of the direction that Judaism has taken. Okay, so he has become a liability to these, to the leaders. Okay, and something's got to be done. And in verse 22, in chapter 22, next time we'll start talking about just what was figured out. Okay, so I look forward to being with you again next week, and we will get back into chapter 22, where we get into Jesus being arrested and a lot of stuff. Action. It's an action-packed chapter. Okay, so thank you very much, and I will talk to you again next week.